It's quite interesting because, as you just described, you were moving sideways within the departments rather than upwards. But it's
Yeah.
in fact, when you work in hospitality, there's this sort of like career ladder that is sort of climbed so quickly, like a couple of years as a assistant manager, and then poof, you're a
Yeah.
manager, and then the 2 years later you are a director, and then you are on into more senior positions. But that also means that the team members, I mean the colleagues, they move faster, and they might move faster across resorts, and they probably do not have the same awareness of the interdepartment responsibilities when it comes to
Yes.
resort operations. In this case, for you, you've covered quite a lot of departments up to today, being a resort manager.
Yes.
What would you recommend to somebody following your footstep to reach the same results? What would you recommend them doing?
I think if I can go back and talk to my 20-year-old self or 25-year-old self or 18-year-old self, I think it'll be self-control is very important.
Yes.
Don't be an impulsive mover. I think a lot of things that's going wrong with the younger generation is the impulsive decisions that we take. We move on impulse. We move jobs. We move from one resort to the other on
Yes.
impulse. With just one simple frustration, we give up. I think that will be one piece of advice. Um, don't make decisions on impulse. Think things through before you make a big decision, especially if you want to move. But at the same time, don't stay in the same place for too long if you're stagnant. By stagnant, I mean if you're in the same job for more than 2 or 3 years, and if you're not moving anywhere, if you're not moving up, or if you're not moving sideways, or if the team or the management or your bosses don't have any sort of interest in moving you somewhere else, just move. Find something else that will keep your spirits up. And
And
I
your
think the next,
motivation, and your motivation going, because a lot of employees and colleagues in the industry, when they see that there is no support from the top, when there is no way forward in terms of promotions and increasing their levels, but then they lose their motivation and they don't believe in the company anymore, in the company values or so. What do you think motivates a colleague today to stay within the organization, to grow with the organization? What can motivate them?
I think for the generation of workers that we have, it's not only locals, it's about the next generation of hospitality leaders. I think they need constant feedback.
Yes.
Constant feedback, real-time feedback, honest and sincere feedback to tell them how they are doing, whether they are doing things right or whether there still is room for improvement. I think this kind of feedback will keep them going. I think a lot of young people who are serious about careers will appreciate honest feedback, and also recognition is something very, very important. People want to be, I think it's an evolutionary psychological thing. We all want to be appreciated and get noticed. So for managers, for HODs, if you want to keep the young generation going and them motivated, I think appreciation, recognition, real time honest feedback are important.
Absolutely. When you think that the most quite often the senior levels, the senior management in resorts and hotels, especially island resorts, I've had experiences in China and Maldives and Mauritius myself. So I see that sometimes the senior management sort of like separates themselves from the the main work body of the resort. But it's
Yeah.
important to stay in touch, to stay connected, to constantly give feedback, as you just mentioned, and to keep motivating the team, because the industry, as you know exactly, has changed. The hospitality workforce of yesterday in the Maldives is not the same of today. Plus, we've just gone through probably a first in a history of the Maldives as a country lockdown, and a
Yeah.
pandemic that has forced everybody to change the way they lead in the industry. And it is an industry that has let's say what the Chinese would say, the yin and the yang, the two powers, the two forces,
Balance it. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
balance of the women and the men in the same industry moving together. I love this saying, when you define hospitality as the people industry. That's exactly what it is. And because it's the people industry, we have young women and young men working side by side. According to the latest statistics, it seems that in Maldives, only 10% of the workforce is women. And of that, we actually look at them even less, 3% of that is local Maldivian women working in the tourism industry, tourism and hospitality. Why do you think is that?
Let me go back to the time when I started in the very last couple of years of the 80s and the 90s. Back then, we had very few resorts in Ariatol, and most of the resorts were centered around Male, the Greater Male area.
Yes.
And of those resorts in Male Atoll, the largest in terms of rooms were Kurumba and Bandos.
Yes.
And in those two resorts, I remember we had a lot of local women. A lot of local women worked in these resorts, especially in the front office. Front office was 90% ladies,
Wow.
and they were mostly locals. So this was the 90s. This was the and this trend continued until the late 90s, and things started changing. I think we need to look at these things into context, because in the Maldivian society we have very sort of rigid gender roles assigned to different genders. All fishermen are men, carpenters are men. Likewise, people who work in resorts are also supposed to be men. And also, I remember when we were studying in the hotel school, our principal back then, Mr. Michael A.J., used to say, every opportunity he got to speak to the public, he would get up and say, tourism is not a dirty word. Tourism is not a dirty business. This was reflective of the public perception back then. This was
Mm.
about 30 years ago. And very little has actually changed, especially in the islands. So tourism or work in resorts is still not seen as a very sort of decent workplace. It's the sort of the sense of decency that we don't associate with the resort environment that needs to change. I think that perception needs to change. And also, a lot of girls who start out in the industry, once they get married and once they start families, they have to leave the industry, simply because they are working away from their homes, and they
Yes.
can't commute back and forth between home and work. That forces them to leave their jobs and stay home. But I think, as we expand more and more, as we have more resorts closer to the population centers, there should be an easy fix for this. If
Yes.
we have regular ferries, then girls and ladies can commute back and forth between their local island and the workplace daily, which will allow them to be back with their families in the evenings after work, or after work, whenever it is,
Yes.
whether
Yes.
it is during the day. So I think there's a cultural aspect to it as well. So there are certain perceptions that we need to change. There are many reasons, as it's a sense of safety on a resort. Like you pointed out, the statistics speaks for itself. It's a male dominant work environment. Typically, in any male dominant work environment, we have cases of people being harassed. It's not only women; it's also men getting harassed, and sometimes women, they aren't always willing to go through this process. And then, I mean, they shouldn't. I understand. And then I think what the public needs to understand is we have mechanisms in place to make sure this doesn't happen. It's not perpetuated. It's nipped in the bud, it's controlled, and the managements will have to put these mechanisms into place and make sure they work. Because there are legal requirements where you have to have committees to deal with any sort of harassment, bullying, or anything, or sexual harassment or bullying or
Absolutely.
anything of
Yeah.
that nature. So I think this cultural context and also sense of safety. Those are some of the factors that
Can
uh,
impact.
yeah, can impact the number of women working in the industry.
Yeah.